Imagine a place where healing begins. Welcome to Hidden Oaks, our serene 46-acre off-the-grid ranch, dedicated to guiding you on your path to recovery from addiction and past traumas. Here, surrounded by the tranquility of nature, we offer a safe space for renewal and growth. At Hidden Oaks, we understand that the journey to recovery can be challenging. That's why our compassionate team is here to support you every step of the way, providing personalized treatment programs tailored to your unique needs. Take the first step towards reclaiming your life today. Call us at 972-932-2033 or visit our website at resolutionshealthcare.com to learn more. Remember, the path to recovery runs through Hidden Oaks. Let us help you find your way. Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle. My name is Alan Hyde, and tonight we are joined by a special guest. Tonight's guest is not only a licensed counselor, but also a brain health coach and is the author of A Life Concussed. Welcome, Jeff Gould.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. It's such a nice invite to get in a warm environment. It's always nice to meet other professionals working in the field that are doing great things. Yeah, it's absolutely good to be here.
Yeah. And you and I were catching up and getting to know each other a little bit before the show, but you do a lot of work with recovery and with traumatic brain injuries, and you had come highly recommended, and there's just a lot of passion I've seen just kind of looking at your website and looking at all the information that you've put out, and I'm excited to get into it with you tonight.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are my passions. Sometimes I think, looking back on my history and being in recovery, when I think of the healers of the world, oftentimes people are drawn to be in the help they were given, right? The sort of treatment joke is everyone wants to be a drug counselor, right, when they're getting sober. And I've seen a few variations of that. There was a guy in treatment years ago that was like, I want to be a psychiatric nurse. And it's like, let me guess, it was a psychiatric nurse that made a difference. But I think there's another group of people also who are attracted to really the help that they weren't given. And some of that really speaks to my experience in trying to create a delivery of care using some different diagnostic instruments to catch a certain type of patient that, like me, has fallen through the cracks over and over and over. So,
and I think with traumatic brain injury, you must see it a lot. A lot of people who, when they come to you, things have been missed.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And yeah, we'll just go with that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought, but yeah, that is very much true.
So in your work, and I imagine this is a resounding yes, but so you help coordinate to get them the right appointments and then educate them on, like, let's say they have a traumatic brain injury, helping them see the signs and then coping in the aftermath. Is that some of the work that you do?
I wouldn't describe it as that. So I do a lot of coordination, but to kind of take it from the ground floor, especially in substance use disorder and behavioral health is $1 trillion industry. There's 6,196 treatment centers. The last census in the United States, that was the count from a couple years ago. And out of those, I'm not sure that any have any good diagnostic criteria. So that's kind of the problem on the front end, is oftentimes people aren't asking the right questions or are not asking enough questions. It's fair to be true. But when I get in touch with people, how's the easiest way to explain this? The brain is a bit of a roadmap. If you know what the lobes are responsible for, prefrontal cortex, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, so on and so on and so parietal lobe, so on and so forth, then if you ask enough questions, and I'm really oversimplifying here, a neurologist might be like, you're really oversimplifying that, but I believe it to be true. I can tell you where they're experiencing neuroinflammation, which is just regular inflammation, but in the brain, and where the axons and dendrites, their neural network, has been ripped apart. As an example, if someone were to tell me, hey, I get dizzy 4 or 5 times a day, I would probably follow up with, and your ears ring also? Yes? oh yeah, my ears have been ringing for weeks, because that's coming from the same localized part of the brain. And so one of the ways I conceptualize this, oftentimes when we address it from a psychotherapeutic point of view, we're treating it as a mental illness and trying to use pharmacology to treat what's a soft tissue injury that responds to healing like any other soft tissue injury, a torn labrum, a torn meniscus, a rolled ankle. Anything like that needs good oxygen-rich blood flow, time, rest. It just needs certain things to promote, if not speed up healing. And so that's the stuff I really get into, which we were talking about, which I would call integrative medicine. That said, I specialize in comorbidity, when addiction and concussion, addiction and brain injury, addiction and brain tumor exist in the same space. That can be a pretty complicated patient, but that's my passion in a nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when we're out running and gunning in life,
Right.
traumatic brain
Right.
injuries tend to happen
Right. Yeah.
in those realms.
Exactly. There was a study that came out of Ohio State University. These people weren't really so much in the clinical realm as they were in the research realm, but they did 4 studies on non-combat veterans, combat veterans, adult population, non-military, and adolescents. And I think they found the numbers across the board of people, when asked the right questions, even with the adolescents, the number was 55% had what we'll call a cerebral incident. They had hit their head pretty hard and considerably were changed by that. And then you go up to the combat veterans, and it was 67. So I would say between 55 and 67% of every patient in residential treatment now has had a concussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And sports play a big role too. Early in my career, I used to work at the Amen clinics for years.
Yeah.
They, they have the world's largest study on NFL players
Right.
with the SPECT imaging.
Right.
And man, to see some of those like scans of the blood flow being restricted from certain areas,
Right.
like when the prefrontal cortex is cut off, is it any wonder that this individual isn't making functional, logical choices on a day-to-day basis?
Right.
They may be able to hold it together in some areas, but that's where I hear when you're kind of touching on guiding your clients through seeing some of the symptom connections.
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot of people you work with where like, man, I've never had anybody break it down for me like this.
Yeah, I do. I try and keep things in simple and understandable terms. And I mean, even from home, one of the first things you want to do to heal the brain is if you understand what the body does. Our body in essence is a giant healing machine. It's built to heal itself. A cell that's driven by the mitochondria, as I see it, really has 2 functions: to heal or to grow. It's one or the other. And so one of the first things you want to do in healing a concussion is stop adding the continued insults, right, to that condition to give it to heal. As an example, one of the first things you may want to talk about is if I were working, with a guy, I'll ask him pretty early on about food,
Mm-hmm.
And if you're eating 99-cent Tostinos frozen pizzas and you don't drink any water and all you drink is Coca-Cola all day long, you don't even have a fighting chance. You could do hyperbaric oxygen, you could do glutathione treatments, you could do a lot of different stuff, but you're probably not going to get well because you're not giving your body anything to work with, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What you're putting into your body has a direct impact first on your gut, then on your brain.
Right.
And it's
right.
that route I've always found really fascinating. But it's interesting because my background, my dissertation was on how the brain needs like 36 months of like functional sobriety without substances to heal.
Right.
And I mean, you and I know working in treatment, it's like what treatment center anywhere is going to offer somebody 36 months to heal. Yeah.
When they told me that in treatment, I guess it was 22 years ago now, that was like not good news. We had a class on post-acute withdrawal syndrome, pause, right? You may be forgetful. And oh my God, I remember that first 4 months, they would take us to the grocery store to buy our own groceries and treatment. And I would have my little apartment key on my finger and be twirling it around and just kind of set it on the Cheerios, and walk over there and look at the top ramen. And then 20 minutes later, it'd be like, who stole my house key? And I finally had to get the big old biker wallet chain and chain everything to it. Or I'd lose my hat, sunglasses, shirt, wallet, everything. I almost needed a monitor, a bodyguard to follow me around, because I was pretty spaced out for a long time. It was really a struggle to get my brain back from addiction and whatever else I had going on. So,
It the fog is real, and I saw that you had mentioned in your bio too, talking about that experience with brain fog. And
right,
maybe for our listeners, because we have quite a range. We have professionals who tune in each week to just kind of stay sharp, and we have a lot of just kind of the lay public who like what we're talking about. And I would imagine there's handfuls of people listening who relate to what you were just sharing, kind of that brain fog of like, who stole my keys, but we left it sitting there 20 minutes ago.
Right.
What are some of the kind of disclaimers or information you would share about just kind of getting to a place of awareness of like what they can do to get better with brain fog?
Let's see. So but let me break down a couple things so people can understand. 3 things are common, if not probable, when you get a concussion. It was explained to me that it takes about 90 pounds of pressure to truly concuss the brain. However, the C1 atlas bone, which is your top vertebrae on the spine, it only takes about 6 pounds of pressure to knock that out of alignment. Basically, if you've got a concussion, you've also injured your spine to some degree with it. The problem with the C1, because of the way the head moves, it's the most mobile of the vertebrae, and it also sort of houses where the 2 main arteries carrying blood flow to the brain go up. And so, as was explained to me by a chiropractor who specializes in what we call subluxation, if those arteries have a kink in them, when you're watering the lawn and the water turns off and it's like, oh, the hose bent, that can happen. And what's going to happen is your brain is going to back up with really bad toxic blood flow that's unoxygenated. And that's where a lot of your headaches, your vision, things like that are going to begin to come from, like an awful lot of discomfort, which tells you from the top that one of the first things you need is a chiropractic adjustment. Now, behind that, a lot of people don't really know this, but one of the main keys to spotting specifically a concussion, I'm not talking about open head wound, is actually through the iris and through the eye. Will tell you a lot. We have right eye testing. I work a lot with C-Rod, which is a plastic device. But one of the things that can happen is one of the eyes can start to vibrate. The eyes will become slightly out of sync. And this is really interesting to me. So as we're talking, there's probably, I speak in general sweeping views of the truth. I'm not a neurologist, but as we're talking, there's probably about 10 programs running cognitively. We need to orient to where we are in a 3-dimensional space, which takes an awful lot of executive functioning to live and stand up and orient in 3-dimensional space. Your eyes need to read my lips and make it match up with the audio that you're hearing through your vestibular system. And then your memory needs to keep pulling English words in reference to, oh, I know what he's talking. He said concussion. I remember that. Addiction. I remember that. So we're basically kind of a giant walking video camera with arms and legs. Well, what can happen when the vestibular system and the ocular motor, when there's a glitch where those 2 programs hook up, one of the things that's going to happen for people suffering from concussion is it's like watching a bad Netflix feed where all of a sudden the audio and the video aren't lining up, and you might not be aware of it, but your prefrontal cortex is going to start to cave in, and the world will no longer hold your attention because it's difficult, it's headache inducing. if you went to a psychiatrist in that state, you're probably going to get a false ADHD diagnosis unless they ask the question, have you had a concussion in the last 6 months?
It's a very, very good point to highlight. And we talk a lot on this show. Just, I think, if we talk about the realms of trauma and we talk about all of these different aspects of ADHD is such a popular diagnosis right now. And it's, I think, something to clarify is, you can get the information in places like this, but getting with the professional and going through a full proper assessment and making sure that battery is correct. And what we mean by battery is a battery of assessment. We're assessing for trauma, we're assessing for traumatic brain injuries, we're assessing for, how you're functioning in your daily life, like all the way through, so that we can understand what the actual diagnostic criteria is that we're treating. And a lot of people, I think, get mistreated in today's society.
And as a therapist, sometimes just a good concussion can either upshift or downshift your polyvagal system and kind of leave you in a permanent state of fight or flight. Something else that will resemble the same thing. You see this a lot with combat veterans, Afghanistan guys, Iraq guys. When you've had, I've even seen this with people that have just worked on military bases, just training around cannons or training in tanks. When you keep putting shock waves through your pituitary gland, which lives right there between your two halves, what can eventually happen is your hormones are just going to get trashed. Your HGH will go low, your progesterone will go low, your T will go low. And think of it as, like, in this case, a male version of a cousin to, like, postpartum depression, what women go through after they've given birth. And again, if you're not asking the right questions, you can't counsel somebody through a biological crash that has them feeling sad or feeling very, very, very angry. That really is a blood work thing. And so I think I'm starting to draw a clear picture that there's kind of a lot to this stuff to kind of troubleshoot and ask some questions. Probably a couple. I'm really a big fan of DOs. That's who I work with. I don't work with as many neurologists per se, but a DO, for those who don't know, is a Western trained medical doctor who's also a chiropractor who has degrees in both.
Your integrative medicine background, kind of, as I was prepping for that doesn't surprise me to hear that those are kind of some of the professionals you
absolutely
coordinate with.
And I work with some good ones here in the Metroplex. I brought patients here, from all over the country and had them housed here and helped them kind of work out some of their problems in real time. And that's something I've really gotten a lot out of. So, yeah.
There's so many routes I want to go with you, and we have plenty of time as you and I get to know each other to talk about these things. But you made this really interesting point that I think just like clinically is really important. I've had plenty of clients over the years. They'll come in, they have postpartum depression, and they've come from a clinician who wasn't taking the time to ask the proper questions. It's like, I'm a dude, I'm never going to give birth, but the symptoms are so clear when you know what to ask. And you're highlighting this about the brain. I remember when I was in my young 20s coming into the field and someone would talk to me about kind of the way the brain functioned, like, this is like woo-woo. And the reality is, like, when you see it, all right, when you can get get in the realms where you can see the scans, you have a professional that can explain and connect the symptoms for you. It's actually the conclusions are very logical if you know where to look.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, a good scan is kind of key. Again, if I ask enough questions, I can get a general idea of what was probably going on. Sometimes you can get a sense of which way the brain bounced inside the skull, right? Like sort of, there's a word for this in OT. It's either like cross laterally, but forward behind. But sometimes you can actually get a sense because a brain, keep in mind, sits in fluid. And so if you were to put a golf ball in a jar, in like a jar of baby food and water, and shake it, that's what's going on with your brain in the middle of a concussion. And as it turns out, even though we all enjoy contact sports, I love the National Hockey League. I'm not anti anything. I'm definitely pro-help. But as it turns out, and you know this from working at Amen Clinic, we weren't really built to hit our head. I mean, if any of the listeners remember back in science class in 7th grade, they pass around a human skull, and everyone's like, whoa. And everyone like me probably put their hand inside it, and there's these razor sharp edges everywhere. So you're talking about something, the consistency of flan or custard surrounded by razor sharp edges, and it wasn't really meant to, be banged around in that space a whole lot. I mean, it's pivotal and instrumental as to, and I mean this clinically too, the way our life is going to unfold is paramount to what's going on, and the way, and our processing speed, all of it is going to be the rudder for the rest of your entire life. So it would kind of behoove us to take as much care of it as we can, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. To put all the, the safety guards in place. If you're talking about a bowling alley, put the guardrails on, know, and it would be really, it was valuable for me to see, but it was also heartbreaking when you'd see these guys come in and they were very successful football players and their lives are in shambles because by the time they're in college, they've already had like 1,000 concussions,
Right. I have an opinion on that. There, in terms of junior hockey, Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, which is kind of the Montreal greater area, the east coast of Canada, took hits out of the game in junior, and a lot of people, of course, the old guard of the hockey were appalled, and you got to learn how to take a hit and all this. But one thing, I want to kind of jump on what you were talking about. We have an undefined number, every person, of what I would call an accumulations of violations. How many concussions might you be able to withstand? Might be 17. For me, it's 19. So if someone's passionate about sport, and we're going to start that count when they're still a teenager, took a bad hit in junior, there's one. Took one right after Christmas, there's one. Then the truth, by the time they get to the National Hockey League and actually start getting paid for their passion, they got 2 good hits left in their pocket, and they're out of the game forever. And so I think there's something to be said for learning how to take a hit, but I think there's something to be said. If this is how you intend to make a living, why don't you preserve that as long as possible? And then you switch to the NFL, and the sad truth, a lot of people, I want to clarify this for the listener, CTE is not a brain injury. CTE is a condition as the result of 1,000 subconcussive brain injuries. And by condition, I mean, if you've ever seen it up close in person, I have. It's a little bit Parkinson's and a little bit Alzheimer's, and it's horrific to see in person. It's truly disabling. So
and lots of addiction, lots of rage, tragic.
It's very dark, right? It's very dark.
Yeah, I played baseball my whole life until I became a clinician, and when I was working at the Amen clinics, you get to get your brain scan for free, and they'll walk you through and show you everything. And when I was a teenager, I was walking out of the dugout. One of my teammates was swinging his bat, and it hit me in the back of the head and knocked me out. When I did my scan, that one spot, all right, it was lacking the blood flow back there, and they had asked me, like, if you had any major hits. I didn't remember that. That's another part too, is like working in clinical environments, doing assessments, clients don't remember to tell you everything either.
I just came up with something I think is kind of genius, but so going back to Daniel Amen, who I know I've met and I've been in part trained by. He had a thing that on average you have to ask somebody 10 times if they've had a traumatic brain. Have you ever had a concussion? No. Have you ever had traumatic brain injury? No. I think that's twofold reason. One, they're not quite sure what that means when you're asking that, or how to kind of put that in diagnostic criteria. The second thing is the event itself is usually shrouded in some sort of memory loss. If you got a little swimmy and it was it was 30 years ago. Example, I was sitting in a screening, very good friend of mine. This screening had been going on for 2 hours, and we had asked her that question 6 times. Have you had a traumatic brain injury? And she said no. And then we asked her, have you suffered from complex trauma? And she says, I have. When I was a teenager, I went from the back seat through the windshield of a car. The driver was killed, broke all my teeth out, and landed in a field about 30 feet away. And I was like, I hate to tell you this, but I've already asked you that question 6 times. Yeah. But she could only identify it as psychological trauma. She was like, that's a traumatic brain injury. So when I work with people, I actually just switch the question. Instead of letting you determine, maybe I can help determine it for you. What's the hardest you've ever been hit in the head? That's what I ask people. What's the hardest you've ever been hit in the head? And then if they say, well, I fell off a 10-speed bike and my head hit a fire hydrant and I was unconscious for about 5 minutes, it's like, yeah, you may not be aware of this because we come from the old school where you just got your bell rung, right? But you got up and then you may or may not have vomited on the sidewalk, but you got up and walked your bike home and walked it off. And so people are thinking, but I'm okay, right? And it's like, well, change is very subtle, right? Mm-hmm. You may not, I never put together after my incident at 13, my life changed radically. I went from a kid who rode a BMX bike and played with a magic set and I was just a kid to, this is like 1983 and like 2 months later, I'm like cutting myself with knives and listening to the dead Kennedys and telling my mom I want to die and just having nightmares. And I had never put together, like, I didn't put that together, that this cause and effect. I never put that together. It just simply didn't occur to me that the fact that my head was wired back together 6 months ago as a 13-year-old kid might somehow be bleeding into, because in fact, at the time, I was given a CT scan, and their criteria was, well, you don't have a vascular bleed, which means you don't have a stroke, and your skull isn't cracked, and we think you're probably fine. And so I said, okay, well, I don't have a concussion. And then 3 months later, my personality changed, and I can't remember a dang thing. And every time I try to actually think about something, I get these kind of ice cream headaches, and one of my eyes is starting to wander all over the place. And they didn't even ask for a follow-up appointment. And to be fair, it was 1984. We didn't know a lot about this stuff. Right. I mean, even the criteria for combat, and still was in Afghanistan, is are your eyes, your nose, and your ears bleeding? Is your skull opened up? Do you have cerebral spine fluid coming out of your ears? Or can you see someone's, like, not to sound morbid, but can you see brain matter coming out of someone's head? It's like, you think that's your criteria for a brain injury. Geez, Mo. I mean, but it's well below that are life-altering sort of things, and they're subtle, and most people aren't even paying attention when it happens. And then 3 years later, 6 months later, they might be having all sorts of emotional relationship problems, job problems, and never really be able to assemble their own data and kind of, in essence, kind of be validated in a way, like you're not a jerk, and you're not too stupid to do this job, and you're not, like everything, even clinically, the complex trauma, it's all connected, and it's very, in a very sublime way, serving as the rudder for our life, and we're unaware of it. I mean, some of my spiritual stuff I've been getting into lately, I've been thinking a lot about this. Human beings are these ethnogenic, soulful creatures packed into physical matter, and I've met enough people to know this. We have the power to cure cancer by meditating and imagining it long enough. Like, human beings are really intense, soulful creatures, but we crack our head open and start doing some drinking and go through a couple bad relationships, and it's like we kind of forget what we are and the power that we actually carry. I mean, I'm really big into really helping empower people and helping kind of, in essence, remember what it means to be alive, right? It's pretty cool. That's a whole nother, we just took a sharp left turn.
Ethnogenics is a big turn,
right,
for another time. Because there's some really interesting work that's happening in the clinical world around meditation, and there's a lot of research on it. Not enough yet where I would maybe on my show go into it too deep, but it is fascinating.
Right.
There's this point, you were kind of touching on as well, of like those little shifts in the personality where no one is making the connection of the traumatic brain injury. I saw this with friends, and I have a buddy, he did his dissertation on the percentages in teenage traumatic brain injury to increase that doorway into substance use.
Right.
Because we know as clinicians how observable that is. Like,
Right.
not only is that the window where they're going to start being introduced to substances, but traumatic brain injuries, those who I knew personally when I was a teen were much more likely to be doing things like that. And that's just stopping at the big conversation of like substance use, let alone, like you were mentioning, like the personality shifts and the different ways that our emotions can just start to get out of whack.
Right. And one of the, I was talking to one of the real leaders in our field who's been around and started 2 or 3 brilliant programs, and she gave me some really good advice today. She said, be an educator and not a disruptor, because I get a little bit intense sometimes. But one of the things I've come to see, and back to what you were talking about, if in fact a traumatic brain injury is the cause of substance abuse, right? And so you get placed now, the most obvious symptom that's obvious to everyone is the cocaine and the alcohol, to place someone in residential treatment and not address the other half of their presentation, to me, is kind of like we're going to take a schizophrenic who's also been drinking and using drugs and put him in residential treatment, but we're not going to address the schizophrenia. We're just going to have them talk about their relationship to their father and work 12 steps. And you're really underserving half their presentation, keeping your fingers crossed and hoping it goes well. And again, this is just me talking, not to be Jeff the Disruptor. I think it's unethical. I mean, I think it's unethical to hold on to a patient you're not qualified to treat.
Yeah. Well, the whole time you were sharing it, because I mean, you were around too in the field when all the stuff was going on in Florida, and it's like they were doing a lot of that down there, where it wasn't about the symptom presentation of the client; it was about the insurance that they could charge the client, and that's the kind of stuff where, at least just being in this area, I'm glad to be in this area because there's a lot more likelihood in Dallas, Texas, that people are going to be above board, which I like. I came from California, moved here about a year ago. I won't say that it's quite where Florida got to, but there's a lot of unethical behaviors in the treatment centers. But it's a base of what you were talking there. Is like it's a lot of good people who get into it. Not every single one of them, right? Because it is a $1 trillion industry. But I think a lot of people get swept away by how easy it is to charge the client without even having to worry too much about the symptoms.
I think, yes, to everything you said. I think in this specific case, though, I don't think it comes from malintent. I mean, it could. I think it just comes from underinformed, just like 21 years ago, complex trauma was like, what? Complex trauma now, that's common language. And so I think we're just starting to open the doors to, hey, is it possible that a brain might be compromised from all kinds of things in terms of efficiency, in terms of function, in terms of being able to communicate with itself, so on and so forth. And so it's nobody's fault if we're, in essence, unaware of it. But I think in 10 years from now, I like to think that the criteria to enter a treatment program will be a brain scan, will be a very long questionnaire, and to really, one of the big buzzwords we throw around in treatment, people are, they're like, we do holistic care.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you do regular vanilla care, but you have a yoga class. Like that's not holistic care. It's just the same care the other 6,196 treatment centers are offering there too. And so I find human beings and difficulties are fascinating to me. And so I'm going to talk out of both sides of my neck. From a problem point of view, it's like a Rubik's Cube to be solved. It's just people are so interesting and there's so many dimensions to the way they're suffering. But one thing I do to remember when I'm working with someone is whether we're using hyperbaric oxygen or IV glutathione or neurofeedback or biofeedback or OT or PT or ocular motor stuff, There's a human being in the middle of that with hopes and dreams and values, and that the best served, all of those things I just mentioned, that's just window dressing. You know what I mean? It's helpful, it's technology, but I think people want to feel loved. I think they want to feel heard, and I think they want to feel understood. And based on that kind of connection, that's actually what, to be honest with you, that's why I don't use my clinical license. I'm a coach. Because as a clinician, you can't self-disclose, or it's just not appropriate to tell people about your life and what you've been through. But I find there's value in a shared story. That, and I get to work in all 50 states. I'll be honest, from a business perspective. But when I'm working with someone, they know exactly who I am and what I've been through. So when we get into the self-pity, and nobody knows the way I suffered, nobody knows the way I feel, it's like, rest assured, I absolutely do. And everything you're walking through in treatment, I've been through myself, or I wouldn't recommend it in good faith. And so it just feels good to have a different connection. I just had a talk with a guy. This he has a brain injury. He did all his protocols. He's gotten a lot better. He's been fired from 3 jobs in a row because he can't keep up on the line. He can't keep up with the sandwich line. And I just had to tell him the other day, and I had tears in my eyes when I said it, and he did too. And I said, I don't know why this happened to you, brother, but you have a role here on planet Earth. You have a place here on planet Earth, and I'm going to help you find it, whatever that looks like and wherever that takes us. You're alive, and you survived this for a reason, and we're going to figure out what that reason is together. And if Jersey Mike's or wherever isn't working out, that's fine. We'll just move on past it to the next thing that is going to work, because it's hard. I mean, there's just levels and dimensions to this stuff, and it's even, this, just recovering from addiction or alcoholism alone, it's a bear. Like, it's a bear. And then you add some complexities and some brain injury into it, and when you're on the other side of that, it feels impossible. It's not, but it can get to feeling that way. So.
Yeah. And for those listening, this is, I think, just that example you gave. This is what we're aiming for when we have these conversations, is for those who relate to what you're sharing, number one, to be able to find you if they are hearing this and think like, hey, I want to work on some of this stuff. But it's like, to do the work, the actual work of looking at yourself, being honest with your shortcomings, whatever those shortcomings are, it's worth it.
Right.
It's worth it. Now, it's like, you may have all the resources and live in a penthouse, or you may be on the street. Who's to say that's not equal, right? And that was something I learned a long time ago, walking, to tie in a point you made earlier of like, I don't know if it's, people get into the field because they want to provide what they got, or they want to provide what they didn't get. But one of the things I learned early on, being a wounded healer, going through things in my own life that brought me to this field, is that, nobody, no matter where they're at in life, is any worse or any better than me. They're just a human being. And if we can get on an equal playing field and discuss these topics, these issues, the world will be a better place. And I think we've been you've met the team in the back, and I think they've been seeing it too. Is like, when you just sit down and have these conversations, people show up, they listen, they want to be a part of it, and things start to move.
Right.
There's a lot of hope in that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think, what did the Buddhists say? The deeper the mud, the bigger the lotus, right? And so, sometimes we're just being primed to kind of go through stuff, and to the degree that we can clinically begin to make peace with our suffering and see, what would they say in Andean cosmology? That's really where our medicine from the world is going to come from, is from, like you said, our own suffering, right? Once we kind of reconcile that and see what that was about, it's transmutable for people that have suffered from the same thing. And what a gift to the world that is. And just to play that small role in helping. I had a thought. We had kind of talked about the rooms of recovery, and I had a thought a long time ago. Even if you tried your hardest and you only changed one person's life in all that time, that's still one person's life that you change. That's somebody's kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids who didn't have to die in jail or on the street. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. You know, it's a pretty cool deal to be involved in this and just see, and, you know, working in the field or doing it for fun and for free. Yeah, I mean, there's some things that happen that are pretty taxing. We have a really high death toll in our industry and in the rooms of recovery. It's a high mortality rate because that's the crowd we're working with. But the success stories, I mean, are just, there's a guy right now, did his intervention 8 years ago. He'd actually DUI'd himself. He'd been driving, I mean, just hammered drunk, and just pulled over and called 911 and was like, I need help. I can barely drive. You know what I mean? Yeah, they helped. You know, they showed up pretty quick. Anyway, I knew his mom, and they asked me to help do an intervention on him 8 years ago, and he got a hold of this thing. And now it's like, God, 8, 9 years later, he asked me to minister his wedding just about a year ago. Met this lovely woman, and they just got this, they're very artsy and very neat and have this incredible life together. And just to see, you know, people kind of bloom. It's just, I mean, that's the reward in itself, and know that it really has nothing to do with me. I just played a small part. And, you know, everybody's got to, back to the sports reference, everybody's got to take their own ball and run it down the field, as it were. You know, that's, well, we're being called to the game, and we got to play it regardless of what we're coming through, going through. But it's good.
Yeah. My favorite book in this field, I mean, my favorite book of all time is probably Lord of the Rings, but my favorite book in this field is M. Scott Peck, A Road Less Traveled.
Yes.
And that first line, man, life is suffering.
Yeah.
Period. And then there's that huge gap that he puts, but the description of it is what you were highlighting, which is once we embrace that suffering, life ceases to be suffering. And this is something in multiple angles with my clients week to week I try to guide people to see, is that whatever it is that's keeping you from looking here is the issue.
Right. Absolutely. And anymore, and granted, I've been sober and in recovery for a long time, but usually when something unfortunate comes along, I'm pretty quick to go, okay, you know, so what's the lesson in this, right? Because if you really just see misfortune, it's just kind of lessons to be learned along the way. It hits the palate a little bit easier, at least in my experience, you know. And I've been through some pretty tough stuff, and I mean, it's just life stuff, right? But in 22 years, yeah, you go through some stuff and get to sit with that, and you know, we can. One thing I will say, I don't know if I should say that. I'm kind of a controversial guy with controversial opinions, but sometimes I think in therapy, if there's a dimension to trauma therapy, perhaps where we misserve our now complex trauma is real. Does it affect your polyvagal system? Absolutely it does. Does it affect your somatic system? Absolutely it does. But sometimes I think the framework in which we offer that help, you know, there's this far left idea. I don't know where this come from, but it seems like with younger people today, because I've started to see this patient in residential treatment over and over, that somehow adopted this ideology that they have the right to never be made uncomfortable ever again. And if somebody is making them uncomfortable, it's a microaggression against them, and they need to set a boundary. And like, I don't know, I'm more of a resilience guy, right? Like that life is going to throw all kinds of things at you, and you got to, you know, you got to have some spine and some skin to get through that sort of stuff. But I think a lot of people, by well-meaning therapists, are being taught that, well, I'll just leave it alone at that. So I'll just leave it at that. There's probably half the people just clicked off, and I'm like, I'm not going to listen to this guy anymore.
No, come back.
And others are probably like, yeah, man, right on. So,
well, and that, I think with a topic like that, that's always going to be the divide. You're going to get some of the generations who agree exactly with what you're saying, and then some of the younger generations that are also wanting you to hear that side. And I think it ties into something you were touching on earlier with any intervention, is how do we help people feel heard? you know? And I think the space I've always liked in that is that like accountability is always the answer. You know, if you were hurt by what I said, and I can look and see like reasonably I had a part to play, I'll own that.
No, for sure.
Right. If the logic isn't clear, right, as to like, because I take my inventory daily, right, and I've had to admit some stuff about myself that's not exactly like pretty, and clean that up with people. So if it's not checking through my radar system, I'm just not going to take that on, you know. And I found that too, where like maybe you'd agree with this, maybe you wouldn't. We were that way in our own way when we were that age.
Oh, for sure.
You know, I think that's a lot sometimes what's happening. We just have so much more media now, where it's like some of the younger generations are just, they can talk about more of the angst that we felt when we were younger and we didn't have all the cameras in front of us.
You know, one thing, this is pretty new for me, but one thing, without going into specifics of how I got here, for the first 18 or 19 years of my life, I would describe my interior is about 80% tension, right? Even if it was mild, but it was tension with 20% awe and reverence and deep gratitude. And oh my God, I'm alive, and just flowing in deep love and gratitude. And to me, to offer a quote that you'll recognize, that was trudging the road of happy destiny. Like, life is really hard, but there's some good payoff in there. That's what I thought it was. And I kind of got into, you know, some different dimensions with my spiritual life. And basically what I went through brought me into a deep sovereignty with oneself, I'll use those words, where I didn't find myself bleeding out my power all over the place, based on what I thought you thought of me or what was going on in the room, and just kind of letting people, places, and things be exactly as they are, and not bleeding out my power, thinking or believing I needed you to do something different for me to be happy. And as a result of that, now I feel like my life is 80% deep joy, awe, and reverence with 20% tension. And when the tension comes, I'm super aware of where it's coming from. Like, it's like, man, get off Twitter, dude. Like, this isn't helping you today. So you know what I mean? It's easy, right?
And that's the beauty, I think, of the whole of what you had shared prior and what you're sharing right now is like you had the gumption to say right at the beginning of like, I can be a controversial guy. And it's like, yeah, that's the thing I love about platforms like this is like, let's be controversial, because also when we swing around the whole conversation, it's like, it's actually not that you're being controversial. You're just stating this is my dignity I'm going to stand in. And I was talking with a client today, and I said, you know, what's infinitely more important than free will? He's a really religious guy, and we try to kind of bring those pieces in. I said, what's infinitely more important than free will is standing in your own dignity and letting other people stand in theirs, or else you're not going to utilize your free will. Right. If you and the biggest barrier to that, not the biggest, but one of the barriers that's a very common one is when you try to steal dignity from other people, right? So it's like when you were saying, I'm a controversial guy, it's like, well, I'm going to let you be a controversial guy. I'm curious. Right. I want to hear what you have to say. Right. We have a group of college age students in the back. I'll let them tear you up after. You can have a conversation for hours if you want. But I also know it's like chatting with you before, I can tell you're a guy who's willing to stand in your dignity and just have conversations, who's out here helping people, you know, and that's the real conversation. When people rip each other to shreds over these conversations, cracks me up.
Well, and I will also say, you know, it's really nice to practice, especially in this political climate. I practice often not having an opinion and just watching and trying to see, you know, everybody believes they're doing the right thing regardless of what they're doing. And also, you know, with clinicians and counselors and coaches and helpers, in order for me to help the most people, I really need to see where other people are coming from, regardless of where they're coming from. Because people, in my experience, once you get past the veneer of whatever they're saying on Twitter, are very kind, right? And they have mixed traits for sure, but people, especially in the way we need to meet them, and they respond well to kindness, right? So yeah.
I have one last question here for you, Jeff. We're going to shift gears.
Okay, make it a good one.
we're building a mental health amusement park, and you get to build a ride there. What would be the first ride you chose to build and why? Also, if you could give it a name.
The mental health amusement park. I don't know how often you ask this question.
Every week.
It's got to be the roller coaster, right? Because that's just so enigmatic of mental health. It's got some highs, it's got some lows, it's got some loops, and it's got some other things going on. And what would I call it? Well, it kind of starts with a scream and ends with a smile. So I think I'll call it the smile. I'll go with yeah. If you're still screaming, it ain't over. It's going to end well. You just don't know it yet. So yeah, that's what I'll go with. Yeah.
All right. So it's called the smile.
The smile. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll end with a smile. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Really good to be here in the studio with you all. I just spilled my water a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. We'll clean it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Gould. Gould. Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a blessing. Thank you for being here. And we break the cycle here every Friday night, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. We will see you next week.